Good morning, everyone. We're really hitting the ground running this morning. Is everyone doing well? Having a good time so far? Great. Well, just a structuring note, what I'm going to do is probably start with a few questions for the ladies to my left, and then pivot to Aya just to avoid crosstalk and to ensure that everyone can get their points across. The focus of this session is to really pinpoint the definition of consent in sexual relationships, particularly as they pertain to college campuses. So I wanted to start off with that question. How do you define it? Seems like a straightforward question, but it's actually anything but. So maybe we can start with you, Vanessa. How do you define consent?
Well, that is a big question, and that's the one that's on everybody's minds. So I wrote a book where I went and interviewed about 120 students. I spent a couple of years talking to kids on campuses about consent. And of course, what you learn is that what they think consent is quite different than what most of us in this room probably think it is. And that's because schools have increasingly defined it as a yes means yes standard, right? It has to be not verbal consent necessarily, but something where you're checking in with your partner at each stage of the encounter. You know, this is kind of wonderful, utopian, aspirational ideal that yet is something that's a bit hard to actually enact when you're talking about kids who have grown up in a country where we have some really messed up ideas about what sex should really look like. We have a lot of ideas about masculinity and femininity that are about a man should always push until he gets the yes. A good girl never acts like she wants it. So, this is a really complex stew, and I am supportive of affirmative consent because I think it's a wonderful thing for us to move forward towards. But certainly nobody would look at the situation as it exists on the ground today and not say that it hasn't created a series of problems.
What about you, Liliana? I mean, she mentioned affirmative consent. Consent is a very vague, evolving term. What is the difference between those two terms, and why is it so important that we distinguish between them and establish straightforward definitions for them?
Yeah. So a little bit of background. I've worked on my campus at American University teaching consent education, working with consent education, curricula development, and working with students on the ground on a college campus. So much like the students you interviewed in your book. And I do think establishing the importance of affirmative consent, which is a clear, sometimes verbal yes, not intoxicated, not under the influence of any substance, is a really important thing that we need to establish because, like Vanessa has mentioned in some interviews or other platforms, a yes is a yes and we own our bodies. So it's important that we are able to respect our bodies, respect our partners, respect those people who we're sexually engaged with. And so affirmative consent is part of that respect and part of establishing respectful relationships.
Are there scenarios under which consent can't occur? I mean, what about when a person is intoxicated? Is there any ability of that person to consent in the way that you think is most appropriate?
I think that individuals can consent in given situations, like under intoxication, if they're between two partners. But I do think that it's complicated, right? Like Vanessa was mentioning, there's a lot of nuanced definitions. It's changing, it's developing, it's growing. But yeah, I think under most situations we need to be respectful of our partners and we need to make sure that consent is active and affirmative. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say under intoxication, active consent is present.
Gotcha. Pivoting to you, Aya, I know you've written about this a lot and talked about this a lot. What are the pitfalls of talking about these issues in such black and white terms?
It's a really interesting question because everybody believes that you need consent What is questionable is what exactly it is and how to get it. So, for example, when sex negotiation researchers ask young people and students in their studies about how they negotiate having sex, they don't use the term consent, because using the term consent would produce meaningless data because everybody thinks it means a different thing. So, what researchers have found is that people are incredibly good at reading other people's willingness to have sex. That's why millions of young people have sex every day, and it's not a disaster. It's the cases in which that fine dance falls apart that produces the problem. And then the question becomes, how does the law come in and manage that dance in a way that's administrable? And that is really a hard thing to do. In an affirmative consent world, we have this image of a sex proponent, somebody who wants sex, and a sex acceptor. The proponent has the obligation to get a clear yes at every stage, and then everything will be okay. The problem with that is it doesn't answer a lot of questions. In any given situation, who is the proponent and who is the acceptor? What is the way to ask consent? What does continuous mean? How often do you have to ask? What are the conditions under which consent is valid? So all of these questions come up when that dance breaks down, and that's what schools are struggling with.
What you've just described really sheds light on how difficult this is for colleges to navigate this role that they've now been accountable to fulfill. Do you think that this is a burden that we should place on universities to adjudicate these cases, or should we instead place that onus on third-party entities or another entity?
I absolutely think that schools have an obligation to their students to make sure that they're in a safe environment, and to make sure that when a student feels harmed by an interaction with another student, the school can address it. Now, that being said, sexual harms can range. And I think one of the problems that can come up with the campus rape protests and Me Too is that you can collapse every kind of sexual harm or sexual encounter into sort of the worst form of sexual assault. You're dialing up the rhetoric, and then you're dialing up the consequences, and then you necessarily need a sort of criminal adversarial model. If we could have sort of in-between ways that schools can manage these kinds of harms, educate their students, and create the environment we want, then we don't need to outsource to quasi-criminal organizations. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a matter of sort of understanding that there's a spectrum of these sexual harms that range from very, very severe, where you do want that full process and the full sanctions, to ones that are less severe, where maybe things like mediation could work out, or some alternative sanctions. And I think once we understand that, schools are going to be in a much better position.
Yeah. You're a professor of law, specifically an expert on criminal law. How do you think criminal law standards can be better applied to the way that colleges are navigating these cases?
Well, I think that criminal law is a very tricky question for college campuses, right? So on the one hand, if you say, okay, sexual harms are not only harms to the college community, they're also crimes, you're creating sort of this obligation for the universities to report to the police. But that might not best serve their student community, right? Automatic reporting to the police could actually discourage reporting, or discourage sort of those lower level resolutions that might be better for their particular educational community. So I would question whether there should be such a strong alliance there. But I do think it would be helpful when school administrators are looking at things like affirmative consent standards, or how to define coercion or intoxication, that they do look at the debates that have happened in the criminal context, where a lot of people have weighed in on how to administer these standards.
Great. Back to you two. These issues have been bubbling up for years. I mean, this is not a new issue that colleges are contending with. How do you think that these controversies were in many ways a precursor to the larger national Me Too movement?
I think they're I think they're linked completely. I mean, first of all, I think that a lot of the people who are very active, either as activists or as journalists, or people who came up through college in the last 5 years when these issues of consent and sexual violence were very present on the campuses. So they have been particularly interested in pushing the conversation forward. I also think that the leading edge of what's going on is that there is a sexual assault problem in this country, and that it has been covered up for many years, and that women are ashamed to speak out, and that this kind of cathartic raising of demons just moment of mass healing is what's happening. That is the historic moment, right? And that's both on campus and in Me Too. Now, like so many social movements, that's the leading edge. Well, what comes after it? Okay, well, how bad was it? Well, you know what? That's a question we have to ask, because it is a spectrum. And if my definition of consent is super, super nuanced, and I'm trying to get into that sexual violence, let's shoot down all the predators conversation, things are gonna get kind of messed up. And I think there also, there's been a lot of work on this. There are also cases in college where, not everybody feels that the student who came forward is reliable, right? And that is interacting with administrators who are also playing catch up on this new definition of consent and trying to say, well, our student handbook says this, and this female student says this, and most often it is female and male student, right? Like, how do I navigate that? What is justice? What is my role? I mean, this is so complicated that, as a society, we just want to live in the black and white. Well, you know what? On this issue, you just can't. And that's, I think, very present in the media coverage of this in the last 6 months, where you have things like Aziz Ansari's case, where a lot of people came forward and said, look, we're going to destroy this man's career over a case where affirmative consent was not present, exactly, right? Are we going to do that? And you know what? Within a couple of weeks, everybody was talking about Larry Nassar and how he systematically sexually assaulted over 250 child gymnasts in this country, including almost all the Olympians from the last 10 years. And everybody just turned their heads. So you know what? Both things are happening simultaneously, and we need to make spaces in our minds for that.
Liliana, you've been organizing as a student, you've been advocating for this issue on campus, sort of spearheading a student campaign to combat this problem. What do you think people, in other iterations of the Me Too movement, whether it's in the media or in entertainment, can learn from students like you and your campaign to combat this problem?
So I think both panelists make a lot of interesting points. We are seeing changing definitions of consent. We are seeing changing definitions of what it means, what sexual assault means, and we are seeing lots of growing awareness around those issues. But I do think that the college campuses on this nation are doing such amazing work, along with national organizations. They're doing so much amazing work to shape that definition, and we need to listen to the people, just like we need to look at previous judicial cases. We need to look at college campuses on the cutting edge of sort of defining this issue, sort of allowing justice for survivors, no matter how severe their crime was. We need to see justice for people who have gone through some of the most challenging experiences of their lives. So I think college campuses can really be an inspiration or a building block from which we can develop new policies.
Tell us a little bit more about these pro-survivor codes of conduct that you've been working on, that you've helped shape. What do they entail?
Sure. So we have, on American University's campus, we do have consent education that is mandatory for every incoming freshman. Now we've had at least 3 classes trained in that consent education, and that's talking about these models, talking about patriarchy, talking about gender roles, and talking about how they play a role in our sexual relationships, talking about how to get consent at every stage of a hookup or something like that, redefining these issues. So that's one thing that American University Wellness Center, along with the Students Against Sexual Violence, has also pushed for and navigated the policies through. Another thing is in our Title IX process, working towards more trauma-informed approaches so that students don't necessarily have to sit in the room with their perpetrator. We know that a lot of people would like to say, you know, college campuses are this happy bubble where we're just living in a fantasy or utopia. But I'd like to say that we're building a picture of what justice can really look like in the real world. We know that most people don't receive courtroom justice when they're facing very severe cases in the real world. But we'd like to start building a better picture of what justice for survivors can look like, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that also, you know, we do think of colleges as a utopia, but you know what? They're not a utopia on this issue. They're really not. Mm-hmm. Because what so many of our campuses are doing is reinforcing these really toxic gender norms that we have through the Greek system, through kind of everybody bowing to the male athletes and they're the celebrities on campus and this is what we do on the weekend. Through the insane binge drinking culture that exists where people who, you know, students who are kind of working hard during the week then think that they have to really play hard and they have to get those photos and show everybody, I'm a player, I'm a hoe, I'm a this, I'm a that. So the way that universities have kind of stepped back from the social lives of their campuses has really become like just, you know, it sounds so cliched to say, but I went and spent 2 years on college campuses, and this is like Animal House has spread across the campus. And I'm not saying that there aren't, spread across the country, and I'm not saying that there aren't like alternative dorms. And yes, we have data showing that kids are spending a lot of time on their phones, so thereby they're socializing less, and thereby they're, you know, even having maybe less sex. But what about when they do go out? You know, and so many of our campuses are dominated by a Greek system where frats are the only ones who can have the alcohol, the sororities can't. And, you know, really, I think universities have to take a real look at themselves in the mirror and saying to themselves, we can put up a bunch of consent posters and we can, you know, make sure our Title IX system conforms to whatever rules, whichever administration is telling us we have to have. But what are we really doing on campus? And they have not been willing to do that. You know, okay, you got a Harvard who's saying like, yeah, we're gonna shut down these clubs, but you know, it's not gonna be that simple in most places.
Great. And I do want to open up for questions from the audience, but before that, I wanted to pivot back to Aya really quickly. First, did you have any response to this question of how do we really address the excessive drinking, the Greek life, which obviously play a big role? They're not the only factor in this equation, but they're a big factor.
Yeah, I do want to say something, but I do want to react quickly to the issue about trauma-informed processes, because there's been some recent case law that's come out on this, and the issue with sort of characterizing the campus, of course we shouldn't characterize it as some sort of utopia, but characterizing it as a space that's sort of rife with sexual predators and survivors who need justice. We've heard that kind of rhetoric before in the various wars on crime that have occurred in the United States, and that sort of led us on the path towards mass incarceration. What happens when you are sort of caught up in this idea of epidemics of crime and harm is that you start to see prosecution and discipline as being the ends, right? Like that is what you should try to achieve. And so you create sort of these processes where you're sort of presuming there's victimhood and you tailor the processes to make it easier to prosecute people, to make it easier on victims. And that's good from one perspective, but from the other perspective, right, from the person who's accused perspective, there's a real fairness problem there. So I think that, one of the issues is, what is the type of behavior that is so egregious that we do need to water down procedures and sort of go down this war on crime road, and which aren't? And if we could separate those two things out, I think that the trauma-informed processes would make a lot more sense than sort of saying every single case should be treated this way. In terms of the drinking and the partying, I completely agree. I think it's plausible that hyper-masculine sort of frat athlete standards lead to sexual assaults, but most of the evidence show that participating in this sort of like drinking sex culture underlies most of these miscommunication sexual assault cases. And this is a culture that's participated in increasingly by young women and young men in colleges. I'm sort of surprised to find out that in the post-campus rape epidemic era, sorority and fraternity memberships are on the rise. What can we do about this? It's a difficult question. I mean, some things that some of the researchers have suggested is that young people should be more familiar with sex, sexual pleasure, and drinking at an earlier age. That way, when they go off to college, away from the sort of prying eyes of their parents, they don't go crazy. So I think there are many different ways you can address this problem. I am not completely convinced that the sort of disciplinary model of treating these sexual incidents like rapes is the best approach to these questions.
Great, thank you. I'm going to open it up to the audience now.
Hi, good morning. I'm Andrea Walker from the National Education Association. What suggestions do you have programmatically, or good examples that you've seen in the K through 12 schooling that help prepare kids for getting to higher ed? And then bonus question, as a parent of a 14-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl, how we can help ready them as well. Thanks.
Questions?
Well, I think that, the consent education that California is doing is obviously, that's where people are looking. Instead of like, here, let's put this condom on the banana and here's some scary pictures of STDs, how about we talk about what is consent, what's a personal boundary, what even is texting some girl that you like 200 times in 24 hours? What is that? Should we call that stalking? What is a healthy relationship? And I'm fine with putting it in the context of healthy relationships and not, going predator prey, because I think that there's lots of studies that show that that doesn't work. That boys are like, oh, wait a second, excuse me, and that doesn't square always with their own relationship, because sometimes girls are sexually assertive as well. So that's where I think people have to kind of look at what they're doing in California, try to, I know it's hard in this country, and this is one of the big problems with this whole issue is like, we want to talk about sex in a healthy way, but we have such a hard time doing that it becomes you're a rapist. And so really looking at like, how can we kind of open our minds about healthy sexual relationships, even for kids?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's really important that we have comprehensive sex education that does include, here's a condom on a banana, but also here's information on sexual orientation, here's information on your body, starting from an early age, starting from kindergarten. What is your body and how can you feel comfortable with it? How can you tell someone no? I don't want a hug, or I don't want this or that. How to communicate your boundaries, establish your boundaries, and explore them. One thing that we do at AU is show students like a yes, no, maybe chart so that they can explore their own boundaries about what they're comfortable with, and then communicate that to their partners as well.
Great.
Hi, my name is Ariane, and I'm from New Explorers High School, and I have a question. So I wanted to know, how can male victims speak, out in the Me Too movement, and also, is there a place for male allies?
Great question.
Yeah, I think that's a really hard question. I don't think there's a big place for them in the Me Too movement right now. I think that could change. They'd have to kind of organize and get the message straight, because right now this is very much a female movement. I think there's so much stigma about being a male victim. It takes so long for a lot of male victims to kind of grapple with what happened and put it forward that has not happened to this date. I think there's a lot of room for male allies, and I think a lot of men are becoming really significant allies right now.
Yeah, I think there's some amazing work being done by male allies that's out there about the Me Too movement. I know there's like a couple of articles that were just published during Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and there's definitely room for male allies, and there's definitely room for male survivors to sort of speak their truth, but also support those female survivors and the disproportionate effects of sexual violence.
Great. Well, let's thank our panelists.
Thank you.
Great conversation.